Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Board Gaming Doctor. My name is Phil, and I'll be your Board Game Doctor today. This special episode, this video, is going to be about my journey to one of the goals that I've had for a long time, which is to become the #1 player in Glass Road on Board Game Arena. As you can see, this is now a reality for me, and I'm super happy and excited to share some of the strategy insights and tips that I've learned along the way. So this actually happened on a Christmas night a couple of weeks ago. I had been climbing pretty consistently through the ranks, had a few dips here and there. And it looks like I started really playing on for ELO rankings sometime in June, or the end of June or so, right when the game was released. And so, so it took me quite a bit of time to do so. It took me 127 games or so, 125. I've played a few since then. 92 victories later, finally reached that top. And if you didn't notice, I also was able to snag the #1 spot for the arena season 19, for last year. So that was really cool. So a huge accomplishment. I'm not going to downplay that, but I will say that I don't feel like the best player in the world. I'm sure there are plenty of people who are very smart and very well versed in Glass Road who have perhaps not played it on Board Game Arena and play it in physical form. And there are a couple of opponents that I've played online that I have not beaten as well at all, or have a losing score to them. And so I think a big part of this accomplishment came from really grinding through the games, having like 5 or 6 games in turn-based open at a time, and really trying to take notes and learn from those experiences. And so if you want to do that for any game, including Glass Road, then I think that is a strategy, and to play as many games as you can and have many of them going on at the same time, whether you play real-time or turn-based, to learn from those repetitions, and that'll get you to where you need to go. And so just like I did with my Applejack video, I'm going to present the things that I've learned about Glass Road strategy in a Iceberg tier list format, starting with the tip of the iceberg and labeling these as well with the ELO rankings on Board Game Arena, starting with Apprentice, things that I would teach and have apprentices learn up front about the game so they know what to expect to get their feet wet essentially into this game. And then as I go along, I'll go through a lot of the the insights that I have gathered from these rankings, from being an average player, which is between 100 and 200, a good player 200 to 300, and then a strong player in the 300s. I have not made it to 400, so I won't get into the expert ranking here. But essentially, you keep playing and you keep understanding the game and your opponents, and you should be okay at this level. I'll have some gameplay going on. One of these games, I believe it's the second game, is the one that clinched the first rank spot for me. So feel free to enjoy these. Some of these players are very strong, and I've played against multiple times and have learned a lot from them. So take their feedback or their play patterns as you will, and enjoy those. So let's start off with the Apprentice level. So for an Apprentice, and I'll try to zoom in here. What you want to do is first understand the differences between how a 2 and a 3 to 4 player game works. In the 2-player game, you are drafting 5 cards from the 15 of the specialist cards that you start with, and you will alternate in playing 1 card from your hand. If the opponent has that card, they will play it from their hand, and if you do fill out your sideboard, next to your player board, as you can see here, with 2 cards, you ultimately will be able to play all of your cards and have all 5 of them played out. Versus a 3 to 4 player game, where it's a little bit different, where you each draft your 5 cards, each simultaneously will place down a face down card, and then in turn order, you will reveal the card from your hand, and if someone else has it in their hand, they will play it down as well. So there are some differences in how you would approach what to do in these games, and I'll get into that a little bit later on, but just know that there are some nuances between the 2 and 3 to 4 player game. And then knowing how this game scores is very important, and this is very appropriate here. So breaking down what is scored in the game, you have the buildings themselves that have points on them that is scored. You have points for the bonus buildings or end game buildings as well that will be tallied at the end. And then you have what is often forgotten, which is the leftovers. You start the game with these buildings, 3 buildings on the side of your board printed on, which scores you extra points for each glass, each brick, and a half point for each sand that you have at the end of the game. If you take into account the maximum opportunity to score for these, you will gain 3 points for glass, 3 points for brick, and 2.5 for sand. And so that's a good 8.5 points that is potentially there, which is on par, if not above average, for what your normal end game buildings can provide you. So those are really good to have, or to keep in mind if none of the buildings are really viable for your strategies or aren't offering a lot of points. You can often get a lot of extra points from that as well. So moving on, next let's talk about the average strategies that I picked up during this time of my playing. I noticed some patterns in how buildings were acquired. You have 3 types of buildings. You have your blue production buildings, your tan immediate buildings, and then your darker tan, brown endgame buildings, right? And so with the production buildings, those are naturally what I will look for at the beginning of the game to build. I will look at the 4 that are offered in the 2 to 3 player game, 5 of them if you're playing a 4 player, and look to see what some of these, the most efficient production buildings are, not only in and of themselves, but also what kind of combines with some of the endgame building choices that you have as well. For example, in this game, just taking a look at this quickly, I purchased this sand factory, thinking I don't know what I was thinking, but I think it helped me out. For example, this is a good building to gain a lot of sand at the end of the game if you have leftover food, to be able to score some extra points there. Oftentimes, if you have like a pottery, for example, or like this clay basin, this is a good combination where you have the ability to generate clay and to, at the end of the game, often provide enough clay for your pottery to score. So there are, very good opportunities to provide flexibility early in the game if you acquire those blue buildings early on. So the first round, I'm typically going for those blue buildings. The second round, that is when I look at the endgame buildings, see if there are any matches that combine well with the blue and yellow or tan buildings. And then I go for, especially if it's a really sought after building, I will try to build an endgame building in the second round, mindful of the fact that if I do so, I do let my opponent or opponents know that I am trying to score for that building, and they can plan accordingly with their cards. And so sometimes I like to continue building on my flexibility with more blue production buildings and some intermediate buildings or immediate buildings in the second round, and then start to lay out my design with the endgame buildings in the third and fourth round, with immediate buildings kind of sprinkled throughout to give me that extra boost if needed. There are times when you have a really high-scoring blue building that you would want to build for points in the later rounds of the game, and that's totally fine. But and this is mentioned in the rulebook as well, but having these blue buildings early on will provide a lot of flexibility that gives you some alternate routes in case things don't go according to plan. And then finally, I noticed what a good score is. Here's a really good score between the both of us in this game. A good score, in my opinion, is somewhere between 20 and 25. You can go higher. I've seen games that have gone to the low 30s, and I have won games that have not gotten to 20. But I think you can feel pretty comfortable with your game if you get somewhere between 20 and 25. Oftentimes, that is spread between the 3 different ways that you score this game. You could often say you get maybe, let's say, 7 points from the buildings you build in front of you. You get another 7 points from your endgame buildings, and then another 7 from your leftover resources. So that is one way to think about this game. If you can kind of reach those milestones, you should be in a good spot. Oftentimes, you'll have a good number of blue and tan buildings. Here I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them. I have 2 endgame buildings, and only like 3, or well, this counts for 9 points, but like another 2.5 points of sand left over in this game. And so this was more skewed towards the end game building. I guess if you look at my statistics, I like to have these end game buildings in place. And so I like to have like 2 of them on average, but some players will only have 1 and really go heavy into the visible points as well as the leftover points that you get. And it's easy to get those leftovers if you have the right production buildings to get those basic resources out of the way to provide those upgraded resources for leftover points. But in general, you can kind of approach it that way and see if that works for you, having a good third of points spread across those 3 ways that you score. Now let's get into the good category. The good category, there were 2 lessons that I learned in the rankings from 200 to 300. I spent the most time here. And as I was facing much more difficult opponents, the thing that really helped me bump my way up to the rank 300 and beyond was keeping track of notes, right? This is really applicable in the format that I played this on with Board Game Arena, having this method of taking notes here in the top corner. This is not visible to your opponent, and you can have all sorts of notes here as needed. The 3 or 4 different types of notes I took were, 1, the buildings that I was planning to build from the offering. I would look and see what my plan was. So as this game is pretty much played in a turn-based fashion, there aren't a lot of people playing this real time. I could come back the next day, for example, and remember which building I was going for. That way I could plan out my specialist cards, which ones to choose for my hand, and in which order to place them as well. As I played more, I was more and more comfortable with the order of using these cards, but often and earlier on, I would also take a second portion of notes on which specialists to draw and which ones to play in what order. So, the next note that I would take, the third type of note, was my future goals in the game. So especially earlier on, my immediate round goals for which buildings I would try to build that round included, like the production buildings, for example. And then my other notes would be like, well, this really works well with this end game, building. And so I would keep in mind what I wanted to work for in the later rounds as well. And then finally, once I started to know what my opponent was doing in terms of what resources they had, as well as what endgame buildings they had, for example, I could start to predict what they were trying to go for as well. With higher rankings, we would often be very similar-minded in what buildings are more top tier, essentially, versus what weren't. And this goes especially for endgame buildings. But there are a handful of other buildings across the other 2 colors that are very viable and sought after. And so I would start to make plans to grab those buildings and make sure that if my opponent did get those, I would remind myself in the notes what they had already gotten, so I didn't have to scroll down and figure this out every time, decipher their tableau. But I could often be reminded of what choices I needed to make, especially at the beginning of every round, in what specialist cards to choose. And that kind of goes next with the specialist predictions. This ties into the differences between the 2 and 3 to 4 player games, where in the 2-player game, I found that knowing what your opponent might play helped me decide what cards to not choose. In other words, I could surmise what they were probably going to choose from their hand, and if I could get away with it, I would choose something different but similar to offer me similar resources. For example, the differences between the pit worker and the clay worker, I believe. The one that gives you 2 to 4 clay based off and using 1 water resource. Oftentimes, I would want to use both actions, and I think in a 2-player game, you can really be bogged down if a lot of your actions are spent on cards, or a lot of your actions are just basically one-offs, right? For the majority of the time, I would want to use the benefits for all of these specialist cards, and so oftentimes I was looking for alternative cards to play so that I would be able to play all of my cards and gain the benefits from them in the certain sequence that I wanted to use to build my buildings. There were times, of course, that I wanted to block my opponent. For example, if they had a Friends of Nature house and you're trying to get your quadrant of 4 pits, I could play that pit worker for my hand knowing that I would get a free action once they played it, and I would try to let my opponent play it as well. So that way it could interrupt their benefits from getting a lot of clay or sand, and I would be able to, piggyback and gain an extra resource here or there. So this is very determinant on, what the situation looks like if your plan is to block your opponents. I will say that this is more often the case when you're playing a 3 to 4 player game, where you are playing your card down and hopefully getting the full benefit from it, but hoping that other players will play down a card from their hand so you are able to play an extra 2 actions in any order that is possible, in addition to the 3 that you are for sure choosing. And that's the strategy that I would take in a multiplayer game, 3 to 4. I would choose 3 cards that I knew I wanted to play and what sequence I wanted to play them in, and then trying to mitigate for if I were only able to take 1 action or from each card, I would have some backups that I would try to predict what my opponents would also play from their hand. And it wouldn't matter when in the round sequence that card would be played, but at least it would get played, and I could gain that extra action to further my goals, right? And so I'm looking for extra cards to be played in the 3 to 4 player game. In the 2-player game, I'm doing the opposite. I'm looking to play those cards directly from my hand because the round will end when no one has cards in their hand. And so it could go back and forth between each player until someone has played, 4 cards and the other has played 5. Oftentimes you're going to have matches, and so that won't be the case. But to maximize each round, I found that was a lot more helpful to play the game on my own terms in the 2-player game and to play those cards in an order that is non-interrupted by my opponent. But that's not possible in the 3 to 4 player game, and so that's what I tried to do for the specialists. In addition, a small note for this as well, I tend to try to have at least 2 building cards each round. Those building cards include the I forget the names. You have your supplier here, the not the woodcutter, but the carpenter, the builder who plays 2 buildings for you, the cultivator as well. So you have those 4 building cards. I would choose at least 2 of them for pretty much every round. There were some rounds that I wanted to take a break from building and build up my resources, and so I would try to play one that could potentially match up with my opponent, so I could take advantage of them playing the card and then having my building card or specialist card block them and have my build for the game. I guess what I'm trying to say is that throughout the game, the 4 rounds that you're playing, try to be building every single round. That not only cycles the market for you, but it offers the flexibility that you're going to gain for these blue buildings, as well as providing more opportunities to gain the resources that you need to build some of these extra buildings, especially if the offerings aren't as appealing. You can cycle through them a lot quicker to see if you can find some good pairs and triplets of buildings that work well together. So always try to be choosing 2 builders every round. In the last round, oftentimes I would be putting down 3 cards that have a building action on it, because I had saved up a lot of resources and wanted to really combine them to build all the buildings that I wanted to in that round. So so that takes us to the end of the specialist predictions. And then finally, for the last section, the strong, from where I am now, essentially, knowing what the best buildings are is going to be very important. If I were to look at some of these buildings here, I don't see my favorite building here that is offered. So I will try to remember to put it up on screen, and that's going to be the office. So the office is a relatively cheap building for 1 glass and 1 wood, I believe. And it allows you to use 1 private building and to discard it for any resource that you want. It is also worth 2 points. It is fantastic if you can see this building at the beginning of the game and have that opportunity to use the Feudal Lord. So it is kind of telegraphed what you're going to be playing every round, but at the very least, you have the Feudal Lord to give you 3 buildings, which can equate to extra options, but also to potentially 3 resources of any kind. And so a lot of these offices are great choices. Like, for example, in this game, I had the district office, which gave me some flexibility to gain the forest or grove tiles that I needed for my mansion here. Fantastic building there. Some other buildings that I really enjoy include some of the endgame buildings, such as Glassworks, as well as the clay counterpart, the Masons Guild. They're probably the highest scoring buildings out of all of them combined, scoring a potential of 9 points from that. You do sacrifice the 3 points that you gain from leftover resources, but I found that these really led to some high scoring games for myself. Some other good buildings here. Sandstone Factory is really good. It's a solid 4 points that can convert yourself from sand to bricks. That can give you a lot of extra points, potentially 7 points at the end of the game, with the leftover points that you gain. Clinker Plant is pretty good as well if you happen to build a lot of buildings with bricks. So in this game, for example, I have 6, so that's 6 extra points from Clinker Plant. These cards like the mansion, or these buildings rather, like the mansion, the counterparts for each of the other landscape tiles are solid scores as well. They'll gain you 8 points for each building, or in total, you have a max of 8 points for every landscape tile that is next to them that matches this. And so this is often something that I would go towards and lean towards strategy-wise in my games. And so I mess around and try to get those. I think they would work out as well. Some other buildings that are pretty good. Storehouse is interesting. If you can gain a maximum of 14 food total, 7 on each wheel, then you get 7 points for that. They're relatively cheap to gain, and so it just really matches up if you have the right production buildings as well as immediate buildings to gain that and fulfill that requirement. And slip away some other buildings that give you points for resources. Coal Facility is the counterpart to Storehouse that can do the same thing, but with coal. Slipway and Pottery are really good endgame buildings as well. That's 7 points for those resources that wouldn't score you at the end of the game. And you have the immediate building counterparts like Carpenter's Workshop, which if you play this at the end of the game, you'll automatically meet this requirement and get the full 7 points. And so in essence, the Village Church is also a fun card or building to play for a potential maximum of 8 points if you surround it with no other tiles or buildings. So that's in a nutshell the buildings that I would go for. I'm going to do a part 2 where I do focus on my updated building tier list in the near future. I need to put that together as I focus on writing this article for Board Game Geek as well. But so that hopefully gives you an idea and a crash course on what are some of the good buildings to try to chase, especially those endgame buildings as you try to gain, have a good score at the end of the game. My last bit of feedback and advice for you is something that I learned from a lot of good players, is that you really want to try to unclog your resources, namely these basic resources, and not have a big pile of them preventing you from getting more glass or bricks. It's easier to do so with bricks than glass, and so this mostly applies for the 5 basic resources on the top wheel here. If you can gain a lot of these buildings that offer sand or wood or even food and charcoal, you will be able to have the flexibility to have this be easily taken care of and unclogged and upgraded to your glass from 1 to 2 or more specialist card actions in addition to your production buildings. And it's really nice because a lot of the good buildings, essentially, so going back to my last point, a lot of these great buildings do require glass or do require brick to build. And so I really found that it was very helpful, especially when you're playing against a tough opponent who might be going for the same buildings you are. Sometimes it helps to wait and see what strategy they commit to. If you do so, you will have the flexibility to either pursue that if they don't, or to choose something else that's hopefully just as good, if not better, and have that flexibility by having enough of these resources available for you to purchase those buildings, as well as having an unclogged avenue to upgrade the basic resources further to gain more of these special resources, upgraded goods for points, as well as future buildings that are really good to build. So do keep that in mind. At first, when I started playing this game, I thought, the charcoal kiln is not a very good building at all. It doesn't score you any points, and it turns wood, which is a building resource, into 2 charcoal, which does nothing for me. Well, it can be very niche and helpful if you are trying to unclog your charcoal from either side. You don't have to rely on just plain specialist cards every time. You can save some actions and have some efficiency if you are able to play this down and unclog those resources. All right, so that pretty much does it. So thank you for listening to my ramblings, and I hope that this was helpful. I'm going to have a text-based version of this up on Board Game Geek for you to peruse further. And once again, I will try to go into a little bit more in depth with the buildings as well as the specialist cards. Maybe in the future that might just be a Board Game Geek article, and so if so, I will post it here in the description of this video to refer to, because that's a lot of information that I don't think will be as entertaining on this format. I've already spoken for nearly 30 minutes on this topic for a game that not a lot of people play. Looking at the ELO rankings for this game, to become the number 1 player, it did not take as long as it might have for a game like Agricola or Ark Nova, right? And so, it's not the most popular game, but it's a very fantastic and somewhat easy to learn game, but really hard to and fun to master, in my opinion. And so I really enjoyed this game. Thank you for joining me on this journey, if you have, and for all those who listen to this and have played against me, thank you for teaching me with your gameplay on Board Game Arena. And this was a lot of fun to do. So thank you for consulting with me again. I hope you schedule an appointment with your board gaming doctor real soon, and I'll catch you on the next one. Take care.